Hello and welcome back, and in this video we're gonna continue from the previous video where we built a pie chart using the sector mark. Okay, just to give you a wrap up of what we did in the last video, we created an expense struct and added some sample data basically for the expenses so we can see the example, and then we basically added a chart view adding a sector mark which actually creates an angled pie for the value, and then we set the background the foreground color for each category by setting the foreground color based on the category. Okay, so now we have this pie chart that is ready to go. Now what we're going to do is we're going to basically since all these pies are connected to each other, we can actually create something called a separation between these two. Mainly we actually provide an inset that actually separates them a little bit out, and that is another thing that's very easy to do with the sector mark itself. And what we can do is right after the angle we can pass another parameter called angular inset, and this inset value actually determines how much separation we want between different pies. And you can make this as a dynamic value by creating it as a state property, or we can actually keep it static, and you can go high or very low to create a thin line. Okay, now thin line actually looks good to me, so we're gonna leave it there. Now this is not the only thing that you can do. You can also change the edges of the sector to rounded corners. So right now there are sharp corners, so you can change it to rounded corner, but for rounded corner to become visible we need a little bit thicker line. So let's go ahead and create a line with 4 points, and you can see all the angles are pretty sharp here. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna set the corner radius using corner radius modifier over in the sector mark. Okay, so we're gonna simply say corner radius, and we're gonna set the corner radius as 10, and you can see that the value of corner radius is applied to each section, creating this nice pie chart. Okay, and all the pies are basically connected with these rounded corners. All right, okay, so these are this corner radius and angular inset of the sector are also animatable properties, which means that you can animate the change to the sector radius and inset using the with animation block or using the animation modifier. Okay, so for that what we're going to do is we're going to create a button which is going to trigger the animation, and based on the animation state property, which is another property that we're going to create, we're going to determine whether to animate for the angular inset of 2 or 4 in this case, or 0, essentially sharp edges. Okay, so let's go ahead and add a state property called animate, and we're gonna initially set this to false. All right, what we're gonna do next is basically we're gonna create a button underneath the right below this chart view. This is going to be basically the trigger for the animation, and we're gonna simply say animate. All right, now we're gonna wrap basically we're gonna create with animation block, and we're gonna say animate dot toggle is what's gonna basically toggle the animation. Now at this point this particular animate.toggle does not do anything because there are no modifiers or properties that are getting affected by this. Now let's go ahead and change that by adding the inset only when animate is true, and if it is true we want to set this to 4 for the inset, otherwise we want to set the inset to 0. Okay, so right now if you notice that all of our pies are basically connected to each other, and let's go ahead and click on the animate, and as you can see it's nicely fills in and fills out. So the the separation between these pies appear in an animated fashion. Okay, now you can do something similar for the corner radius by setting animate and saying corner radius is going to be 10 when the animate is true, and otherwise it's going to be false. So our chart actually, or our pie chart, looks like a full circle, but as it animates and creates those sections, it actually separates out and turns into the nice rounded corner. Okay, so this is the effect that it creates. All right, okay, so our pie chart is basically now ready, and we can turn this pie chart and transform it into a donut chart with just few lines of code. And this can be done for this case, basically it can be done just bypassing something called inner radius parameter inside the sector mark. Okay, so sector mark takes another parameter called inner radius. Let's go ahead and format this a little bit so we actually have a little bit room to add new parameters. And now this is basically separated into line. And by the way, the shortcut for that is whichever code you want to change it to multiple lines, so you can actually nicely format it. You just select that code, press Command M, and it is gonna format it in multi-lines, so it's better for the readability. Now, some of the things it does that I don't personally like is it actually creates these extra lines for the parentheses, so I actually remove those. Okay, so let's go ahead and set these. There we go. All right, so this is a little bit better. And what we were talking about was basically adding an angular inset, adding a inner radius into the pie chart, and that will actually turn our pie chart into a donut chart. So right after the angle value, wherever the angle parameter ends, we're going to add a new parameter called inner radius. Now this inner radius takes a ratio, and we're gonna say half of the pie from inside is basically consider that as another circle, or basically add a circle for half of the pie, which actually turns this whole pie chart into a donut chart. And all the things that you are actually gained by creating that animation and corner radius and stuff, they are still working and they are still in play. Now notice one thing, that when we had our pie chart, let's refresh it, whenever the new sectors were created, or basically the separation lines were added, these edges were still sharp, essentially showing the complete pie, basically just separating the pie, and only the corner radius for the outer side was being turned into a rounded corner. Now as soon as you add the inner radius and turn this pie chart into a donut chart, the other side, basically the inner side of the corner radius, are also turned into rounded corners. So SwiftUI in the chart framework automatically takes care of these properties, so you don't have to worry about having the sharp edges for inside of the donut chart. All right. So now given that we have this empty space in the center of the donut chart, we can actually utilize it by displaying some text, image, or user selection. So let's go ahead and show total monthly expense value at the center of the donut chart. So in our case, basically we're gonna add something in the donut chart which is gonna basically display as the total value of the expenses. Okay, now for that, what we're going to do is we are going to add a chart background. Okay, so we're not going to add an overlay or anything like that. We're going to add a modifier. We're going to use a modifier called chart background, which actually adds the background to the containing chart rather than adding it to the entire view. Now if you were to use the regular background, it'll be added right here, but it's not going to be visible because chart has its own content sitting on the top. But if you use chart background, you actually add a background to the chart view itself. Okay, now we're going to create a VStack, And inside this chart background, we're going to create a VStack, and inside the VStack, we're going to have a text called total. Okay, and as you can see, that chart background is shown up nicely right here. And then we're going to create an H stack, and this H stack is going to show the expense. And we're going to use the reduce higher order function to display, to basically calculate the total for, like, from our sample. Okay, now SwiftUI is right now complaining because text does not understand how to parse this CG float, or like the value that we are actually calculating, which is double it, but it's being converted into CG float. And it's thinking like, how do you want me to handle it? Well, what we want to do is we're going to show this as a currency because this is an expense, right? We are trying to show expense. So what we're going to do is we can simply format this using text views format parameter, and we're going to format into a currency, and the code that we're going to use is going to be US dollar, and now the value is going to show up as US dollar. Now you can actually increase the font, so make it large title, for example, just like that, and make it bold as well. Okay, so there we have, like, you have like a nice looking donut chart, and this donut chart not only shows, like, individual expenses for different categories, but it also shows, like, how much total you've spent. Now, in addition to these, you can actually add overlays on these different sections and show, like, the individual values if you want, or create a table basically showing, like, what these each categories, like, stand to, or, like, equate to a real dollar value. Okay, now for improved visualization, Apple also recommends or offers few general recommendations. For example, Apple's recommendation for designing the pie chart or donut chart is that you should not have more than 5 or 7 sectors or 7 sections for, like, better readability. So make sure when you're actually creating these pie charts or donut charts, you have 5 or 7 at max 7 sectors, so like your user can read those values properly. If you need more, try to see, like, if you can leverage other charts that are provided by the chart framework. Now, if needed, some of any remaining value can go into the other. So let's say if you're going beyond 7 sectors, then you can actually combine all the smaller values into other group, and then basically show that other value as a single sector, and then provide some hint or some values where user can go into detail what that other looks like. Now, other alternatives for, like, other types of charts are horizontal bar chart, which can accommodate basically many bar charts and are easy to label with the categories. So it also enables basically user to compare more accurately. Okay. Now, the other thing you should always consider is, like, ensure that your data comprises only positive values. Additionally, be aware that a very small proportion may not be discernible in the charts, particularly for the angle that needs to inset, that needs to be specified. So if you imagine if you had, like, very small expense, a thin line would show up, and that thin line like needs to accommodate this separator, then it would even become insignificant. So all those considerations you should definitely keep in mind while designing your pie chart and donut chart. And with that, we have reached the end of this video. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you guys in another video. Thank you.